So, ultra modern digital camera paired with an old film camera lens. I absolutely love doing this, and I'm going to give you a couple of reasons why you should give it a try as well. Right, so you want to have a go at using old vintage lenses on modern mirrorless digital cameras. How difficult is it? Well, it's really simple. You only really need one piece of kit, and that is one of these. Now this is just an adapter, so obviously with a modern digital camera, so in my instance I'm using a Nikon Z series camera, and the fixing for lenses is what they call the Z mount. So that's the fixing for any lens that fits into my camera is basically a Z. So I can fit any lens that is a Z mount, so this, like this 24-120, this is a Z mount here, so it's made for this camera or this series of cameras, so it fits directly into the camera. Obviously with an old vintage lens that's not going to be the case. So what you actually need is an adapter like this one, which has got the fixing or lens fitting for your camera. So whether you're using Canon, whatever, Nikon or Sony or something else, you just need the mount style for your camera on this side, and on the other side you need the fixing for whichever vintage lens that you're going to use. Now I've got a lot of old Pentax K mount and M42 mount lenses, so I have a couple of, this is the M42 which is like a screw fixing, and this is the old K mount style, and these both go into Nikon Z. So what I can do when I've got one of these is, so this old, this is a CEYOMUR screw fix M42 lens. I can screw that onto there, like so. That's now attached to the adapter, and then this will just fit into the camera like any other Z mount lens. Now obviously on these adapters you don't have any electronic connection, so it's really just a manual connection to the camera, so you lose all things like your autofocus and things like that. But to be honest, for things like landscape photography I don't really use autofocus anyway. I do for things like obviously wildlife photography in a big way, but for things like landscapes I always manual focus anyway, so something that you can take your time over, and it's not really an issue to get something set up really quickly. And that's it really, that's all you need. So whichever brand of camera you use, you just look on the internet, things like Amazon, and just put adapter for Z mount to M42, and you'll get a series of these. These cost normally about 20 quid, and then you've got your old vintage glass attached to your modern digital camera and you're ready to go. Right, so what equipment am I going to be using for this video? Well, I'm going to be using the Nikon Z8, which is a full frame camera. I could use the Nikon Z50 that I'm currently filming this video on. However, there is a drawback that you need to know about if you're going to be using vintage lenses. So because the Z50 is a crop sensor camera, if you put a 28mm lens on it, which is, you know, reasonably wide for a full frame camera, it makes this the equivalent to a 42mm lens. So obviously for doing landscape photography, a lot of the time you want quite a wide view. This is obviously going to make it much more narrow using one of these, so it does make sense to, or more sense to, use a full frame camera. I mean, the reason for that is that obviously modern digital sensors, the full frame sensor is based on the size of the film in old film cameras, so old film lenses have a better affinity with full frame cameras than they do with crop sensors, because you get that crop factor. And obviously in film days, you know, they weren't making super wide lenses a lot of the time, and what you will find is if you want a super wide lens, or as wide as they were doing at the time, when you get down to things like 24mm or 20mm, they are often very desirable lenses and are very expensive, sometimes more expensive than the modern equivalent. So yes, it makes more sense for landscapes to use a full frame camera. So I'll be using the Z8, but that's not to say that you can't use, as I say, crop sensor. You're just going to have to deal with, and maybe, you know, if your camera is a crop sensor and it's got a feature to do a panoramic shot, is to take several shots and stitch them together if you want a wider view. That is another option. So we're going to be using the Z8. I've already shown this. This is the Pentax SMC Pentax M 50mm f1.7. So we're going to be using that. We're going to be using the Super Takumar 35mm f3.5. I'm quite interested to use that actually, because that's a new one that I haven't really used on the Z8 yet. We're going to be using, which is my widest lens, it's another Pentax SMC Pentax M. That's a 28mm f2.8. So as I say, we're going to pit these old lenses against this new Nikon 24-120 f4, just see how they hold up for sharpness if they're anywhere near. I think it should be a good comparison. There is another reason why I think you should try and seek out these old lenses, and I will give you that at the end of this video, why I think, you know, it's worthwhile over and above whether they're as sharp as the new modern lenses. Another reason why I think it's worthwhile trying them out. Anyway, that's enough of me talking in the studio. I think it's time to get out and see if we can get some shots. So yeah, I'll catch you outside. Morning. So we've come out onto the River Trent this morning, not far from home. This is a shot I've taken quite a few times before. You probably can't see on this camera, but right in the background there's an old windmill. No sails on it, unfortunately. But as I say, I've taken this shot before because you've got a nice curve into the image towards the mill, and then you've got a nice bank of trees on the other side that just lead you through into the image. Actually, yesterday morning when we came, we did have some really nice mist coming off the top of the water, and there was a lot more colour in the sky. I don't know whether you can see, we are getting a little bit of colour at the minute. But what I'm going to do is I've put the Nikon 24-120 on initially, and I'm going to shoot shots the same composition at 28, 35 and 50mm, because that gives me a reasonable image all the way through. At 28mm actually the mill looks quite small, at 50mm probably works better, 35 also works pretty well. It's just not quite small in the scene at 28mm, but I wanted to get a series of shots all framed exactly the same, and then obviously what I'm going to do is put the old vintage lenses on, which are at 28mm, 35 and 50mm, and then we'll get them back to the studio and see how they stack up. I don't think we're going to get an award-winning shot this morning. We've not got that mist coming off the water, which we are getting, as I say, some colour in the sky, which is getting quite nice now, but with that mist on the water it does look incredible, this shot. But yeah, that's probably for another day. So we'll take the shots and then I'll see you back in the studio. Right, so for a final test, what I decided to do was come out in the middle of the night onto the banks of the River Trent. I'm not going to stay out here long because it's absolutely freezing, but what I thought would be a good final test would be to pit the Nikon 24-120 f4 against the Pentax 28mm f2.8, and obviously shoot the Nikon at 28mm as well. Shoot exactly the same shot, try and get the best settings I can to get a reasonable image, and then just pit them side by side and see, you know, what sort of results we get. I've never done this before. I've shot the 24-120, did a little bit of astrophotography with it, and I didn't have very high hopes because obviously it's an f4, so it's quite a slow lens. But I was pleasantly surprised by how good it was. So it'll be interesting to see how this old 28mm f2.8 does. I'll try and get the settings almost exactly the same, take the identical shot, and then we'll get it back into the studio, onto the computer, and we'll have a look. Not particularly pixel peeping, I'm not really bothered down to that level, they just have to be acceptably sharp. And what I'm looking for here is really how they deal with the stars, because I found in the past that if you've got a lens that is going to struggle anywhere, it's with wide field astrophotography, where you're trying to get those stars pinpoint sharp with no aberrations or anything on them, no sort of cone shaping or anything like that. So if this Pentax is going to struggle, I suspect this is where it will be. So let's take the images and let's get back and see what we've got. Right, so let's take a look at the results from this shoot. And the first thing I want to say is obviously all the images on the left will be taken with the Nikon 24-120, and it's been taken at the same focal length as the lens that I've pitted it up against. So that will be the Pentax 28mm, the Pentax 50mm and the Super Takamore 35mm. I'd also like to say that all the images are basically raw files that have been converted to TIFF. There's been no sharpening and no manipulation in any way, because I wanted to get them as close to the raw files as possible. So bear that in mind when you're looking at the images. With regard to sharpness, there's been no sharpening done to the images, which will obviously enhance the images when you're doing your adjustments before you use them for whatever you were going to use them, whether you were printing them off or using them on the internet or whatever. So they're just raw images converted to TIFF. So this first image we're looking at here, 28mm for both. The difference, there is a difference in the sort of colour rendition that you get, and some of that I have to say is going to be down to the time that they were taken. So I shot all the Nikon images first at 28mm, 35mm and 50mm, and that was when obviously the sun hadn't come up as much and lit the clouds up, and you can tell that from the image. But I do think that the Nikon image does give you a slightly cooler look than the Pentax 28mm here. So what we're really interested for this test is sharpness, because we're pitting a lens here that is probably one, as I say, I've said before that the 24-120 Nikon lens is one of the sharpest and best lenses that I've ever used of that type. So as you can see here, it's very, very sharp. You can see the detail in the old windmill there and in the trees. If you look at the Pentax, it is sharp, not quite as sharp as the Nikon. It just looks slightly muddier. You know, when you're looking at the detail, it always looks to me when I'm looking at this image as if the Nikon has already had some sharpening, which it hasn't. So it just shows you how sharp it is. Now, that's not saying that the Pentax, when this has been put through some sharpening, will not be very, very sharp as well. It's just when you look at it, it does appear like the Nikon has already had some sharpening. That's how good a lens it is. But I have to say, this is at 100%, and I wouldn't, you know, say that I wouldn't be happy to use that Pentax image to print up or anything else. As I say, it just looks like it's been sharpened. It's difficult to see because obviously you can see here on this piece of reed it's blurred, and that's because there was a little bit of a breeze blowing, and these shots have all been taken at f11, 400 ISO, and normally from about 1.25 of a second to 1/40th of a second is the range. So you are going to get some movement from the wind on these, which makes it difficult to assess sharpness. But I think you can see that, yeah, it's clear the Nikon's really, really sharp, and the Pentax is sharp enough. 35mm, and again you can see there's a difference in colour. Again, that some of that is due to the time that these were taken. But this is one of the interesting images for me, and let's have a look. So if you look again close at the reeds, you can see it already looks like the Nikon's been sharpened. It's so sharp, that lens. But if we're going to 100%, and here I want to explain something to you. Again, it just looks slightly muddy on the Super Takamore, which is on the right here. But there is, I mean, again, Nikon, very, very sharp. This just looks slightly soft, quite soft actually. But there is a reason for that, and it's all to do with the adapter. So this is an M42 adapter, and it's a cheap Chinese adapter off Amazon. And I had a problem with it straight away in the fact that obviously anything in the background I'm using focus peaking on the camera, so basically what I'm doing, I'm making sure that this is all red, so it's, you know, it's all basically as sharp as it can be, using focus peaking, get this all highlighted in red. I couldn't do it with the Super Takamura, and that's because I think the adapter is slightly too thick, which means it's pushing the lens too far away from the sensor, and it doesn't allow me to get focus at infinity. So it's really a little bit of a potentially, well, I know it's not the lens's fault. I think this would be sharper if I was able to focus to infinity and just get this completely in focus. But because the one thing I have done is I've tested that Super Takamura with subjects, you know, 2 or 3 meters away, and it's been pretty sharp. And again, the thing is when you know, if I can solve that adapter problem with this lens, then it's going to be absolutely, you know, no problem at all. Again, very, very sharp in itself, not as sharp as the Nikon, but acceptably sharp. But as I say, at infinity, that did give me that problem, which probably needs either a new adapter to solve that, or one that can be adjusted. So 50mm, and these look very, very similar. I think one of the reasons why is that the 50mm was the last shot with the Nikon, and the 50mm on the Pentax was the first lens I put in after. So as you can see, you've probably got very similar conditions, and in that instance it looks like the Nikon looks ever so slightly warmer, so it could all be to do with the light. And as I say, the main thing I'm interested in here is sharpness. You know, can we pit lenses that run from 30 to 60 pounds or 20 to 60 pounds against a lens that's a, you know, thick end of £1,000, and, you know, can we get results that we would be happy to use? That's the question that I'm trying to answer. So let's have a look. So let's go into 100%. And these are really, really similar to me. There's not an awful lot of distance. There's a hair's breadth between them. I suppose the Nikon probably just shades it again. But I have to say that 50mm does a really good job here. And when you think that lens was made in the probably hundreds of thousands, and yeah, it's really easy to get hold of at a reasonable price. You know, why wouldn't you be using it, to be honest? Again, it always just looks to me like the Nikon's had some sharpening on it already. But you can imagine, you know, with the Pentax lens, once you've done a little bit of sharpening on this, and again you've got movement here from the wind blowing, so you can't 100% tell. But when you look at the sharp, I mean, just look at that here. It just already looks like it's been sharpened. It's incredible. But yeah, when you zoom out and show the whole image, and if you imagine when these have been processed and sharpened, both would be very, very, I mean, yeah, obviously the Nikon's more than acceptable, but I'd be really happy to print this at A3, you know, when it's been processed and sharpened with no problems whatsoever. Now this was the one that I was really interested to see. For me, astrophotography, or wide field astrophotography, which this is, so that's where, basically a term I used to say, where you're capturing some of the landscape of the Earth with the stars behind it. And obviously here what I've used, this is the River Trent, and this is some gantry that sticks out from one of the old gravel quarries. Quite an industrial scene. You've got the framing with these willows, and then you've obviously got the stars in the background. You could probably just about pick out, you could if this was processed, there's the plough or the Great Bear in the background here. But as I say, these are raw files converted to TIFF, no processing. When you process these you could bring out a lot more detail. But just looking at the images side by side, the Pentax 28mm here, I used that lens because obviously it's the widest one I'd got, and for astrophotography you normally need to, you know, you want a wide lens and you want a fast lens so that you're getting as much light in as possible. And you know, the Nikon is f4, so it's quite a slow lens, and I had used that once before up in Aberdeenshire, and I was quite surprised at how good that lens was for astrophotography, bearing in mind it's quite a slow lens. Normally you want an f2.8, an f1.8, an f1.4 just to get as much light in as possible. So let's have a look, and this will tell the story when we zoom in to see how good or bad these lenses are. So immediately to me, you can see in the gantry again, it's that thing where the Nikon already looks like it's been sharpened. It's absolutely tack sharp. That's not to say that the Pentax is any slouch. Once this has had some sharpening, that will come up great. But what interests me here is the stars. If you look at the stars in the middle, both of them are performing really, really well. They're really, really round stars. What you can get is, you know, stars that are split in or cone shaped, but there's a little bit on the Pentax, but not a lot. And as I'm looking here now, when we go out towards the edge of the frame, you can start to see now whether some of this is due to the stars moving. This is an 8-second shot, so it's really pushing at 28mm on this sensor. So there used to be a rule that you would follow for doing astrophotography, whereby I think it was called the 500 rule, where you divide that by the focal length, I think, of the lens, and that gives you how many seconds you can shoot. It's actually not very accurate. What I would recommend if you're going to do this is you use something like photopills, which basically calculates your sensor for your camera, because that has an effect as well. If you've got a really big sensor like the Nikon Z8 has, a 40 odd megapixel, that affects the amount of seconds you can use to get your stars before they start trailing. So there might be a little bit of trailing involved here, but there is some elongation and some aberrations on the stars, look, as you start to get to the corners, but nothing, you know, too dramatic. And don't forget, this is at 100%, so I was really, really shocked at how well this Pentax 28mm f2.8 did. What I will say is I shot the Nikon at f4, so wide open, as wide open as it'll get. I did stop the Pentax down to f5.6, so a little bit more than the Nikon, and you know, the results were just really amazing for me. The one thing you can notice here, there's a little bit of a vignette on these images. Again, that's easily removed. There's none on the Nikon, but there's a little bit on the Pentax. That can easily be removed in post-processing. So yeah, I mean, a lens that costs about 30 quid, and the results it's providing there, you know, certainly for me, if you wanted to have a go at astrophotography and, you know, you didn't want to spend any money on it particularly, an adapter and a £30 lens can get you into the game, certainly. Again, the Nikon 24-120 is not really an astrophotography lens, but again, if you've got that lens and you want to have a go, you know, don't be scared to have a go with it without buying an additional lens. So yeah, really, really surprised. Both lenses performed really, really well. The thing with these images is once you've done some processing on either of these images, you can bring out these stars a lot more. You can get a lot more detail in the sky. So yeah, really, really surprised. That I have to say as well, these images were shot with a 50% moon over to the right over here, so you can see some lightning of the image coming in from the right hand side. And I think here you might notice that's lit up. That's probably from my head torch that I was trying to keep out of the way. It just caught the edge of that leaf there, but I'm really, really impressed with how this came out. So yeah, that was the results of the test. So what are my conclusions? Right, so in conclusion, can you use these old film lenses on your modern digital mirrorless camera, and do they give you good results? Well, in my opinion, yes they do. I've been pleasantly surprised by the lenses that I've used. I think the only issue I had was the CEYOMUR 35mm lens, and I think that was more down to the adapter. I just couldn't get it to focus to infinity because of the adapter that I was using, rather than it being a lens problem. I think they're plenty sharp enough. Bear in mind that all those shots that you saw were basically raw images converted to TIFF, so I'd done no adjustments, no sharpening, nothing had taken place like that, which again would enhance the shots. And I think also you need to bear in mind the fact that I actually pitted them up against probably what I consider to be the best lens of that type that I've ever used, and that's the Nikon 24-120. That's an amazing lens, so if these can come anywhere near it, then you know they're really doing a good job. I'd be happy to use these to print images up to A3 size, no problem at all. So yeah, that's it really. I did say there was another reason to use these lenses at the beginning of the video, and I'll share that with you now, and that's just really the fact that because they were made in the 60s, 70s and 80s, quality control probably wasn't as good in those days. So I know that if I had two Nikon 24-120s and shot exactly the same shot with both different lenses, the results would be almost identical. I wouldn't be able to tell the difference. The same can't be said if you got two identical copies of these lenses, because they can be quite variable, and also I like to call it character. Some of these lenses have a certain character, and that can enhance your images. So, you know, there are certain images that give you certain styles. You know, some of these give a really cinematic look, and they're really highly thought of. So yeah, if you want to add a little bit more character to your images, then you know that can work really well. And a classic example for me is this Pentagon 30mm f3.5. I picked this up really cheaply for about 20 quid, and one day I thought, well, I'll just use it for some infrared photography. And those of you that follow the channel, and I'll put a video up there if you've not seen one of these before, but I do infrared photography, both film infrared and digital infrared. And this Pentagon lens, I thought I'll give it a go, gave it a try, and I always like the Simon Marsden look. So as I say, if you've not seen that video, there's a link up there to one of those videos, and that they give a really spooky sort of image, and this lens really enhances it. For some reason, I don't know why, it just adds another level to the image itself. So that can be a reason to use these old vintage lenses, is that they can add some character to your images that maybe you weren't expecting, and maybe you don't get from a modern lens. Anyway, if you've got any recommendations for lenses that you use on your modern digital mirrorless camera, then please stick them in the comments below. I'm always looking for lenses like this that can, you know, A, be sharp, and B, provide something else maybe to the image that a modern lens won't give me. If you've enjoyed this video, please give it a thumbs up, and as always, if you're not subscribed, subscribe to the channel. That always does help, and I will see you next time for another one. Bye.